So getting back to the topic of this room, the future of consumer is bifurcated, it seems to me. You have the cheap dopamine, and then you have the expensive hopium. So the ultimate cheap dopamine product is the bliss machine. The ultimate expensive hopium product is the sovereign individual, sovereign both in society, as in that book, which everyone should read, but also in time and space. So immortal and interstellar. So the cheap dopamine products, they ignore the body, they hack the brain, and they minimize the carbon footprint because you're in the pod. You know, it's like an AI plus VR plus a sustenance sludge plus evacuation catheters, you know, the eye chair that becomes the bliss machine. The expensive hopium products, they prioritize the entire meat bag of consciousness, not just the brain, not just where the dopamine receptors are, not just hitting those spots, but it emphasizes the meat's health and its rejuvenation and individual creativity and autonomy. And it burns up a lot of resources. It's expensive. And it does so to enhance like the sovereignty and optionality of the individual. So you got the, you know, large language model teraflops and the Bitcoin miners cranking out decentralized systems, and they're all less efficient, but they're more free. It's expensive and it has a big carbon footprint. But the hope is we can transcend being chimps with smartphones and reach a step change and become immortal, interstellar, and more moral on a plane which we can't even imagine right now. So moral innovation as well. The cheap dopamine products, they're enjoyable, but they enslave, and there's no creativity of any sort. No new explanations, no babies, just lots of individual, hyperlocal, small carbon footprint brain bliss. And it's small carbon footprint because it's all, you can create stuff very easily that appears to be real, but it's not. And you can repurpose all of the different, you know, AI girlfriends and change this or that. And, you know, it doesn't cost anything. So it's very cheap dopamine, cheap bliss, very local, but it doesn't lead to anything new. And then the expensive hopium products are painful, but ultimately more enjoyable, which is a point Matt was making, because they expand our capabilities and what we can create, more and better explanations, more and better babies. So the bliss machine, as Naval pointed out, and Norgard, is the dead end for our species. Maybe it's the jumping off point for a matrix-like super intelligent AGI, but for us, you know, human beings, Homo sapiens sapiens, it's pretty much the end. You die in the pod, no kids, you've had a great time, bye-bye.
I also want to highlight a really important nuance, which I don't think got enough attention, which is that thus far in this modern world in 2023, we have a lot of sources of instant dopamine, which is a spike of dopamine, which feels good for pleasure and then drops down and makes you feel pain and depression. And that's why a lot of people who are constantly on TikTok, which is the closest thing to a pleasure button, end up depressed. But there are more feelings of the human experience than pleasure. There's a feeling of peace. There's a feeling of love. And in the hypothetical limit, like Naval talked about, if you got a Neuralink strapped right into your brain to recreate any possible feeling, and you're basically just a brain in a vat at this point, the question is, how tempting will that be to feel all the feelings you wanted to feel? The feeling of success, the feeling of anything you could imagine. And I think that's a lot scarier than the pleasure center argument or the TikTok argument.
That's just a technology problem, I think, in the same way that us all being in a simulation is a technology problem. I really think that if you wanted to duplicate the full gamut of human experience such that you're never left unsatisfied, not through some kind of blunt bliss, you would have to simulate something like the entire universe.
I actually don't think it is, because I think that, there will be species that are always designed to go out and aggregate more knowledge and more energy. And you're never quite going to get any virtual simulation or thrill that is going to be as high fidelity as base reality. But that's just an intuition. I obviously can't prove it. So I think the Fermi paradox is just more easily explained by the vast distances between the stars, the unlikelihood of biological life evolving, and, we just haven't been around long enough at this level. But, sooner or later, we're going to make contact, my guess.
Yeah, so I work in the games industry a fair bit, and I know people designing MMO games. And what they're doing as a design goal, the overarching design goal, is to completely duplicate the full gamut of human experience and civilization. So you have people working, you have people exploring, you have people with a variety of different roles working together for like complex player-driven goals, right? And you can see the effects of that with people living their lives in games like World of Warcraft, right? Because it actually does provide a lot of what your psychology demands in living in the world. But people quit those games, right? And they actually don't like them because, again, you have to suspend your disbelief a little bit to live in that world. As I said earlier, I think that if you wanted to go all the way, such that you no longer even need to suspend your disbelief in some kind of like brain diode driven experience, then you would need to simulate reality.
Right, but any simulation of the universe is going to be lower fidelity than the universe itself. So at some level, you're also going to have to forget that you came from a higher fidelity universe. So either you have to wipe your memory and you're still in some kind of drug or VR-induced haze that tricks you into thinking this is as good as the thing as you left, or you live in base reality and you struggle harder.
The memory thing is interesting because I agree that actually does kind of solve the problem of needing to really duplicate all of reality. But at the same time, like, I think that makes it a significantly less attractive option to buy in. So I'm not as worried about it as a civilization-ending force. Like, I think that any service that scrubs that much of your memory such that you can no longer distinguish if a virtual world is reality is tantamount to some kind of euthanasia, where, like, significant parts of yourself are gone or warped.
Well, if VR porn is cheap dopamine, then meditation is the fat marbled Wagyu beef of dopamine.
I keep starting to interact on this topic, but I'm not even sure which way to come at it from. I think as someone who makes entertainment, who works kind of in the edges of new tech and entertainment, and someone who has been in recovery from alcoholism for 23 years, I have so many opinions about dopamine that it's hard to know where to start. Isn't that the truth? I think that's the key, right? That of course people are going to use this. Of course, when they're stressed and they're tired and they don't feel like they have any control in their actual lives, in their actual countries, in their actual families, they're going to reach for those things that they can have control over. It makes complete sense. I mean, I know that in tech, we tend to be a bit anti-regulation, but I do think that is a viable opportunity for us to at least try to give ourselves some space.
I can see it now. Biden's new dopamine czar requests $10 billion in funding to track people's eyeballs using Neuralink to make sure that kids aren't consuming too much social media.
And if we are living in a simulation, those guys who designed us and our base reality are just biting their nails and saying, look, guys, we just created you a brilliant simulation and now you're just escaping it for your crappy lo-fi versions.
Crappy lo-fi version. I think every political group probably is pro-regulation when it comes to something that they feel they have a right to regulate. When it comes to consumer rights, I think that's where I try to give people grace and assume that when someone is trying to push forward some kind of regulation, that it is in order to safeguard the rights or abilities of the consumer. I had a really interesting conversation several weeks ago about what economically consumerism incentivizes in its current form. I think one of the things that I find really compelling about this app is what I'm consuming. When I participate, it gives me the pause of being thoughtful and really listening to other people before I respond. If I respond, giving me a chance to not just type up some response and hit send and then think about it more later. I can really respond in a conversational way. And I'm excited to see where it goes.
As predicted first on Airchat, Elon would lean into crypto rails before anything else to build out his super app financial infrastructure, and it appears that's exactly what's happening. Yesterday, they filed for a license to become a crypto exchange. It makes a ton of sense for a few different reasons. The first is positioning. This is the beginning of that super app story, and it makes sense. Second, they already have a ton of creators that are getting payouts. Why not reduce transaction costs by using Bitcoin or Ethereum? And third, I think this begins to tell the story about all the things that are going to happen inside of X.com for the future. And what's brighter than crypto and a community of 500 million people? So here we go. Both the KYC and the taxes seem like an absolute nightmare. On the KYC side, I just had to re-KYC with Coinbase, and it was a multi-day process, which caused tremendous amounts of pain for myself and them. On the tax side, I feel like there's got to be a software solution coming that handles this, and I'm much more optimistic, but the KYC stuff seems like a black hole. I envision you would start with the big creators and move downwards, but even that, what a pain. Much like Felix mentioned, I went to the Midwest this summer, and I don't want to pass judgment on anyone, but I want to explain what I saw in the grocery store. When I first walked in, easily 30-40% of the store was dedicated towards the sale of alcohol products. Directly adjacent to that was tobacco products. And then kitty corner was this impossibly long aisle selling sugar products. I thought it looked like it was Halloween, but this was the middle of the summer. This was the first experience you have walking into the store. And when I walked up and down the aisles, I was somewhat blown away because I saw brands I hadn't seen in 20, 30 years. I thought they were discontinued. These are obviously processed foods from, one of these 3 or 4 big companies. I just made this note to myself. I don't know why it came back to me, but I thought to myself, I bet you my grandparents ate this when they were kids. I remember, some of these brands my grandmother had mentioned to me. She's been dead for 28 years. My grandfather, 38 years. I went to the produce section. It was non-existent. And then for a moment, I was like, wow, I got to get to the meat section. I got to see what's available. This is cattle country. This stuff's going to be incredible. I wonder what local farmers are selling here. And so, ranchers, excuse me. And I went to that section and I could not believe it. It looked like the meat had been sitting out for days on end. The texture was terrible. The color was terrible. The selection was terrible. If this stuff was in Los Angeles, the manager would have been fired an hour ago. And so it just kind of hit me. I was like, wow, this is incredibly different, this experience from, the experience that I have where I live. And the choices are simply not the same.
Interesting takes here in this room. So I'm curious, right? So there is this look where we can have a kind of a negative view on the world, but okay, what actions can one take, right? From the perspective of a consumer, individual, right? So I think there is this game that we can play in money. And there's 3 paths, right? So you have real estate, you can invest in business, and liquid assets, which are my most favorite because you can get in and get out. Trading's fun for me. But yeah, that's a way, because I feel, okay, some of the sentiment with, bad corporations, perhaps is the bad, they're not paying people enough, or they buy some politicians to enact some policies, half of America doesn't like. But it seems like the core is money, right? So we can definitely win. We can win that game. And investing is the way to win the money game. In the modern world, working a 9 to 5, just a regular job, you cannot build wealth that way. But that can be used to lever up and get to a different position and start playing the money game.
I do think that actual financial knowledge is a very valuable piece of the puzzle. And I also think that there's a spiritual aspect as well. And to go back to that boy who's praying to God that the priest stops abusing him, what should he actually do instead of praying to God? He should figure out who his real family is, who his father is, and ask him for help. Because the priest asks you to call him father, but he's not your dad. Isn't that strange? Why do they do that? Is that because children trust their fathers?
I loved following along this story. It fueled me with that testosterone back, let's tear down this goddamn system kind of energy. And it's exciting, but I think we got to be careful with that, because the reality is that although there are avenues for higher entities to addict us, the people, through algorithmic media and addictive substances, I think this attack vector is only available against a population who isn't judicious about what they let into their mind and body. And I think that solution doesn't come from challenging companies like Tencent and Kellogg. I think it comes from just simply not needing them in the first place, because we do have to wake up and start educating each other about the new world we live in. But I think the best way to fight back against these larger entities is to simply not need them. We don't need this shitty food from Kellogg. We can grow our own food. We don't need algorithmically generated and recommended content from TikTok. We can go on Airchat and talk to each other about genuine things that we actually choose to talk about. So if that helps.
Yeah, totally. It reminds me of how Ben Franklin promoted the growing of hemp by American farmers to decrease their dependence on England, because hemp can be used for a million different things. So to bring it back to the topic of the group, what is the pro-social future of consumer? I think it's using these new technologies like social media or 3D printing or cryptocurrency to empower ourselves to become more independent and self-sufficient, to grow our own food, to improve our relationships, to share information, to teach our children without government schools.
But what do you attribute that to, Norgard? Because it's free market, right? So is it just that in the Midwest there aren't wealthy people that will demand the bespoke sort of Erewhons, and where I live in Northern California, the Buy Rights and the Good Earth Natural Foods and the Whole Foods? I mean, Whole Foods was purchased by Amazon. I presume that they have a distribution in the Midwest. I'm curious if you drew any conclusions or have any thoughts on that. A really good point, Timothy. I have a lot of links with Europe, and it's very true. They spend very little on defense because we spend so much on defense. And then we have the additional burden of then wasting all our money on these stupid wars that go on and on. And so we go into all this debt. So yeah, they're living high on the prosciutto because we are making all the bullets, the guns, the tanks, the aircraft, and fighting all the wars. In summary, the future of consumer is most people climbing into the bliss machine for the cheap dopamine, paying for it with universal basic income, distributed by a government that's funded via a tax on the consumption of expensive hopium by sovereign individuals who gladly pay the tax just to be left alone. That it?
That is a good point. I never thought of it like that, in terms of we're already kind of there. I think you raise a good point. People who resist and choose to avoid these temptations will avoid these temptations if they try hard enough. I guess in the future it might be a little bit more difficult, depending on how society is structured, but especially when we have easier access to dopamine, people who realize that it doesn't make them happy will also avoid it.